Okay, thanks. Just for the sake of this interview, well, let me preface first. The way that the questions are kind of set up, if I may repeat something you may have answered in the previous question, so just kind of bear with me on that, and I do apologize beforehand.
No worries.
All right. And for the sake of this interview, please introduce yourself, tell us about you, what you do.
Yeah, my name is Caroline Bauman Steimer. I am the community editor at Chalkbeat, Tennessee. Chalkbeat's a nonprofit news organization. We exist to write about local public schools in the states that we're in. So Chalkbeat, Tennessee is headquartered here in Memphis. We write a lot about Memphis schools, Shelby County school system. But Chalkbeat's, we're a network, so I work with people all over the nation. So community editor is kind of an interesting title. It can mean a lot of different things. For me, what it means is I spend a lot of my time reporting. I write a lot about the Achievement School District, which is the state-run school district here. I also write a lot of our kind of human interest in the school stories. So we have a series called How I Teach that profiles teachers, How I Lead that profiles educators. That kind of very community level reporting. It also means that I manage our social media feeds. I'm our event planner, so whenever we host in-person events. But those pieces fit into this larger, overarching part of my job, which is how does Chalkbeat connect with our community, and how does our community connect with us, and how do we involve our readers and our constituents and the reporting process from A to Z, not just, oh, hey, be our source, and then when we publish the story, here you go. Aren't you so glad we did this for you? It's more of a, what are you actually wanting to know? What are you wondering about? Allowing readers to bring their expertise to the table, and then in turn, writing stories out of that expertise and going back to them with more questions, and it's more of a cycle.
Okay. All right, so to kind of break down, I'm going to ask, this is sort of looking at the relationship between social engagement and credibility concerning online news. So this first section of questions is kind of on the engagement portion.
Yeah.
So the first question I'm asking you is, how would you say social media has changed journalism?
How has social media changed journalism? It's a huge question, and there are so many pieces to it. The piece I'll take out of it is no longer can journalists, publish their piece in their newspaper and or publish their broadcast that'll air at 5 o'clock news and say, okay, we're done now. Our people know where to find us, our readers and watchers know how to access our content, and it'll be in your morning newspaper or it'll be in your 5 o'clock broadcast. That mentality was a big mistake, and it's one of the reasons why journalists, why journalism organizations are so out of touch with their communities. But what social media has done has created, the Facebook and the Twitter feeds you're bombarded by places to find news, right? You're constantly seeing sources, some of them more valid than others, and there's not that voice of authority anymore. I live in this small town, and I have one newspaper, and that newspaper is and one TV station or radio station, and those are the only two sources of news I have. Now I pull up my Twitter feed and literally see thousands of sources to go to for everything from a new restaurant opening in Memphis to politics in the Middle East. And suddenly my news consumption is no longer just local. It's no longer written by people who live down the street from me. It's totally shifted the way people consume news. And it's also created a real opportunity for journalists to, in my personal opinion, correct mistakes of old, and to really work very hard to meet people where they are. One could argue that before the age of internet and social media, maybe that would have looked like a journalist coming to a coffee shop like this and inviting their readers in their town to come sit with them and have a cup of coffee and talk about things that are going on in their lives.
Right.
Today, there are a lot of different types of coffee shops. There are Facebook groups, there are Reddit threads. There's still that in-person events that's so important, but social media has created hundreds of public squares when there used to be one. And that's really, really changed the game for journalism.
So with this next question, and you've kind of touching on this with your response, a lot of journalists, they talk about the importance of engaging with the audience, that it's kind of a two-way street.
Yeah.
Again, you were touching on that, but I'm asking, do you think that's an important factor that journalists have to consider today?
I think the idea that journalism is a two-way street is one of the few pieces that might actually keep journalism around. And so it's not like I don't believe that journalism is a two-way street or like kind of a culture of listening or a culture of engagement. Like those aren't, maybe we should do that because they'd be advantageous to us as journalists. It's like you do that or you die. And I think we see that in the landscape of media today.
Right.
It's not just, advertisers are putting their dollars in different places and that's why newspapers are dying, or local broadcasts, or everyone watches Netflix, that's why no one's watching the news anymore. Like those things are true. But journalists were really arrogant in the assumption that they were going to write the most important stories and everyone was going to agree with them. And so to actually answer your question instead of getting on my soapbox, I think journalism as a culture of listening is kind of the way I like to phrase it, but it could be journalism as a two-way street, is the future. It's not a question of whether or not journalists should or should not do it. It's a question of, do you want to have a job in 5 years?
So it's a kind of do or die, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in real time.
Okay. So, and you were kind of touching on this when you were describing, your role of your job, but when it comes to interaction with your audience, like, what do you focus on more? Is it kind of, as far as communicating with it, is it strictly engaging? Are you kind of allowing the audience to get more in your work, or is it just sort of a mix?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's a danger to talk about like engagement in a way that means just getting more sources for stories. And that doesn't change that's the same thing we've always done with like a new fancy term to put on it. So when I think about like how Chalkbeat, which we write about education, specifically really public education, that's K through 12 public education, that's all we do. When I think about our different audiences and how we engage them, it's not a one-size-fits-all equation. Like, we host specific events for teachers. We have really, really active teachers who interact with us on social media, but also who come to our in-person events, and like our relationship with them as the experts on what we're writing about. Like, we write a lot about education policy and this high-level, broad stuff, and that's good, and somebody needs to do that, and we're happy to. But we also, if we're not constantly connecting our work back to like how does this policy decision specifically affect teachers in the classroom, how does it specifically affect students, if we don't draw that line, we're not doing our jobs well. And if we don't then take our work and put it at the feet of teachers and students and parents, we're also not doing our job well. It goes back to what I said earlier, which is I personally believe that journalists never had this luxury, but no longer do we have the luxury of saying, here's our stuff, go read it. We have to find the audiences that we want to consume our work, and we have to say, here we are, here's who we are, here's why we exist and why you should care about us. But also we have to build trust, right? Like, if you meet me off the street, you know nothing about me, you know nothing about my organization, like, you have no reason to trust that we're going to produce work that is valuable to you, and we have to earn that, and that's a relationship. And that's the way that I think about our audience is in terms of relationships. Like, what does Chalkbeat's relationship look like with the education community, teachers, principals, policymakers? What does our relationship look like with parents? What does it look like with parents in East Memphis, and what does it look like with parents in Fraser? Like, those are very different groups of people, and our relationship with each one of them should look differently. It's like a group of friends. If you treat them all the same, you're going to lose friends. And if journalists treat all their readers the same, they're going to lose readers.
What skills or tools do you use to communicate with your audience? And I guess by tools, I mean you can social media platforms, for example.
Yeah. Again, there's not one tool that we use across the board. So what I mean by that is like the education elite, right? People who are making decisions at the school district and at the State Department of Education, they get our newsletter, which is kind of Chalkbeat's main product. It's a daily morning newsletter called Rise and Shine. It's our work that we break down for you, but we also aggregate articles about education from around the state. So that product is really designed for people who are in the trenches of education, who live and breathe it. And it's a really effective product. Our Facebook page, like I said, we have a lot of really active teachers who are doing the daily work, but maybe don't need the statewide coverage that we provide in our email newsletter. So we have a lot of teachers who are signed up for our email and are really benefit from that. We have a lot of teachers who follow us on Facebook, who are constantly sharing and commenting on our work. And I've put forth a great amount of effort to make sure that our Facebook page is a place that you want to be, right? It's not a place where you're going to get attacked viciously for your beliefs. It's not a place where trolls are going to run rampant and say whatever they want and say things that are not true. Again, Facebook is a public square, and if people show up to the public square and throw rocks at each other, you're going to kick them out.
Right.
And that's how we treat our Facebook page. It's a place where people can have disagreements and dialogue, especially teachers,
right.
But it's not a place where you're going to beat each other up.
So moderation is definitely
it's like, again, like how did we as journalists allow there to not be moderation? Like, we always like to blame other people, right? Like, there are terrible people who write terrible things because they think it's funny or they want to incite, or they're Nazis. Like, there definitely is a group of people who are horrible, believe in horrible things, want to write horrible things and incite violence. That's a small group, I think. I think a lot more than not, it's just people who know how to play other people and think it's funny. And like, we have zero tolerance for that. I have a lot of respect for people on our Facebook page who disagree with one another politically, disagree with one another on education initiatives, and like get into the debate, and we leave all kinds of room for that. But the minute you attack somebody directly, you're off. Like, we're deleting your comment, we're messaging you, telling you why we deleted your comment, and we're sending you our policy. We have a very strong comment policy, and that should be something that's easy to find on a journalism organization's website, and it should be something that journalism organization is referencing throughout their Facebook threads. Like, if I delete comments on a Facebook thread, a story that we post, I link to our comments policy as Chalkbeat Tennessee. I show up as Chalkbeat because I'm the moderator, and I say, hey guys, we want you guys to disagree and have a dialogue. Don't do X, Y, and Z that you did wrong. Again, here's our comment policy. And you'll be amazed at how people, like, I used to have a guy who would comment on our stories all the time. I could tell he was actually reading them. And he would just say really, like, dumb, hateful things. And I messaged him a lot. And, you know, people can write that person off and say, like, oh, they're just a troll. But he changed his practice. Like, the things that he says now, he still believes what he believes, right? And I may not agree with it, but he can communicate it now to other readers in a way that's acceptable to the public square. And I think journalists do not trust their readers enough. But I want to go back to your actual question because I don't know if I answered it. So social media, We also are starting to use something I'm really excited about, and I've been following for a long time, which is, so the problem is that we're an online news organization, and Memphis has a very stark digital divide. There are a lot of people with smartphones, but there aren't a lot of people with internet at home, relatively.
Right.
And so we can't expect people to like pull up our website and find our work all the time. So we address that a couple different ways. Sometimes it looks like showing up to community meetings with articles that are literally just printed out and passing them out. We did that a couple years ago at a school closure meeting. We had this amazing data set that we had analyzed about different criteria for why the school district was closing schools. Printed out that article, took it to a meeting, public meeting, and you saw Memphians, parents in particular, but also teachers, going up to the mic to address people in power with our articles in their hands, referencing data points in the story and their questions. It was really powerful.
Yeah.
It's such an archaic idea, just give somebody a piece of paper, but when you do it in a way where you as a journalist go to where they already are with information that they need, it's really powerful. It takes some effort on the journalist part, but it's not that much effort. It's really powerful.
That's interesting. It's really interesting you bring that up because it's the first time I've heard of an organization having to go worry about getting their stuff out print-wise versus online.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. It's a funny paradox, but something we're also starting to experiment with, like literally just starting to experiment with, is something called ground source. It's a very simple way to put it is that it's a software system for journalists that allows them to use SMS text messaging on a mass scale. So let me give you an example. We recently hosted an event where we had a captive audience. We were doing a panel between some education officials in Memphis. Had like 500 people in the room. And so instead of like passing out cards, physical cards for people to fill out about like, what'd you think of this event? What questions do you still have? Who are you? Are you a teacher, a parent? You know, who's at this event? Instead of doing that in a paper, physical form, we said text the word education to this number. It's a number we have through Ground Source. And we already had a survey built into the Ground Source software. And so when the person, just on their phone, didn't matter what kind of phone it was, smartphone, flip phone, whatever, when they texted in the word to the number, it triggered that. And so it was, you know, basically I had a conversation with hundreds of people without ever touching my keyboard because I had already programmed it into Ground Source. So it was like, hey, who are you? It sounded better than this, but it was basically like, who are you? Text 1 if you're a parent, 2 if you're a student, 3 if you're a teacher, 4 if you're just a concerned citizen. And then depending on what number they texted in, they got a different response from us. And like, we were able to have a productive conversation and are still having productive conversations with people through SMS text messaging. We've sent a lot of, you know, what was so cool about that event is one of the last questions was like, what questions do you have from this panel or just about education in Memphis in general? And a lot of the questions that people sent us were questions that we had already answered in previous reporting. So I just went and found that article and sent them a link and said, hey, we addressed this, or we sort of addressed it in this article. We know there's still more work to be done. Like send us whatever thoughts you have about this piece or questions you have in the future. It's really exciting and it's very worth looking into Ground Source in particular. Because I think they're doing, again, like SMS text messaging, that's like the 90s, right? Like it was cool then. But it's a really effective tool for reaching people in particular who may not have, you know, a laptop sitting around at home to access your website.
I've kind of answered this question before, but I'll go ahead and shoot. So in your experience, based on how you've tried to interact with your audience, would you say that they've reacted mostly in a positive manner? Or?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. Something that I am really proud of is whenever we get an email from somebody who's dissatisfied with us, Maybe they're upset about the way we framed a story, or noticed an inaccuracy in an article. 9 times out of 10, or really I'll say 8 times out of 10, they'll start with like, I love you guys, but but you messed up in this way, and I want to tell you about it. This is something we've worked so hard to do, because we came in as a new organization. We have a weird name. What is a chalk beat? Nobody, had heard of us before.
Right.
They didn't know we're a nonprofit. We disclose our funders, so you can go find who funds us. It's not like we're trying to hide that. But there's a perception of like, who are you guys? Like, are you going to be fair? And we've worked really hard to prove to our readers that like, we're going to provide the best coverage about public schools in Memphis and the broader Tennessee area. But we're also not assuming that you need us, which is something journalists have done for a really long time.
Yeah.
We want your schools to be better. We want our schools, this is our community, we want our schools to be better. We think a way to create better quality schools is to have meaningful conversations with accurate information. And we're going to do both those things. We're going to provide a space for meaningful conversations, and we're going to produce accurate information. And if we don't do one of those things that we promised, tell us, and like, we'll apologize. You'd be amazed at how far a sincere apology will go in reestablishing trust. Again, it's a relationship. If you're my friend and you hurt me, and you don't say you're sorry, you think you're going to be my friend for much longer? If that's a repeated offense?
Right.
We're not perfect. We don't get it right every time. We try really hard to, but we don't. And so when we don't, our readers know how to reach us. They know how to tell us, and they also know that we're going to respond thoughtfully. And if we don't do that, then we do not read us, because we don't deserve you. You're everything. Our reader is everything. They're your source. They're the person that you shoot ideas off of. They're the people who actually read your content so you can have a job. And they're also in some ways the police, right? Like, they let you know when you've messed up.
Yeah.
And if you lose them, then what are you doing?
Well, switching gears from producing news to consuming it.
Right.
How do you consume your news online?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of newsletters. Shocker. With that being kind of Chalk Beats, one of our bread and butters.
Mm-hmm.
So, I enjoy my local newsletter, and I really enjoy my national newsletter. So I get the 901 from the Commercial Appeal. I get the email newsletter blast from the Memphis Daily News, from the Tri-State Defender. I love the Skim, national curation of news. Quartz has a really good newsletter. Do I read all these newsletters? I could keep going. Do I read them all every day? Absolutely not. Like, I skim some of them. I usually try to always read the local ones, especially because any news organization can reprint Chalk Beat articles for free. It's part of our model. So a lot of times we're in the newsletters or referenced, and I want to make sure I'm keeping track of that.
Okay.
I love newsletters because they're not, I know who they are coming from. I know the source. It's right there. It's Quartz, it's the Commercial Appeal, it's the Memphis Business Journal, and I trust the people who are producing it, right? They've earned my trust. Sometimes they lose it, and I let them know. Whereas, just consuming news via a Twitter feed, it's really disjointed, right? Twitter isn't topical, it's information coming from all sides, and I don't know if I can always trust it. So emails are kind of my preferred way of consuming news.
And when you're consuming, what are you looking for from your sources? What's...
Yeah, accurate information is paramount. I want to know that I'm reading something that is true, or as close to the truth as we can get. In local news, I love the Memphis Business Journal because I love knowing what's going on in my city. And I'm not in business, but I work for a news organization, and It's super helpful to know like these big movements. What's happening at like city council, or what's happening with FedEx, or what's happening where the new cool burger place is going.
Right.
Like all of that is information I'm wanting because I'm a Memphian and I want to know what's going on in my town, and that helps inform me as an education reporter as well in this town. But I'm also looking for, I'm looking to be a well-rounded individual. And so while I love consuming local news, and I'm a local journalist, so obviously I've got a lot of stake in that, I also get this fantastic newsletter from a longtime foreign correspondent called This Week in Africa. And if he takes this, because I want to know what's going on in other parts of the world,
right.
but I can't possibly know what sources to trust because I don't live in those places or know that culture well. And it's so much, Africa is huge, right? Like
yes.
I would spend a majority of my week just trying to do what he does for me, which is take all of these news organizations and with his expertise in a fairly lengthy email, so I don't always read every bit of it, but I scan the parts that I'm interested in, breaks down what happened this week in Africa. I think something that makes me sad is how nationalistic we can be in our consumption of news. And part of it makes sense. You want to read about things that you know. But I also think we have such a better understanding of our world and our place in the world if we're reading news, if we're reading sites from or if we're getting information from other news sites. So I'm also a big fan of the Financial Times. They also have great newsletters, so I read them often.
All right. This next set of questions has to do with credibility.
Okay.
So, just gonna ask. This first question is, when it comes to online news, how do you measure an online news story's credibility?
Yeah. I may not be the best person to answer this because I rarely go to a site I don't know. I pretty much never do that, actually. And I'm a journalist, right? So I'm very skeptical of if I see an intriguing article, but the website it's taking me to is Hot News 101, I'm gonna exit out of that. I don't. So I don't go to news sites ever that I don't know. Again, as a journalist, I'm very well versed in what news organizations are credible and what are not, in my opinion, right? Because there's always bias there. So I go to ones that I think are going to be the most credible. But within news organizations that are credible, they still mess up, right? They still write things that are wrong. So when something catastrophic has happened, like a school shooting, I never, ever, ever first go to the Washington Post or the New York Times. Not because I don't trust those news sites, but I don't trust their parachute journalism a lot of the time. So if I want to know the story as it's developing of something that's usually horrific, like a hurricane or a school shooting, I'll go to that local paper. Because I trust them. They know the context of their community. And they have better sourcing than the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're probably going to have a more accurate story. So that's an example where even a credible news organization, I may not trust their online coverage of something that's breaking. I think a real tragedy in journalism in the digital era is I'm a big believer in the future of journalism being collaborative. I think it's we all float or we all sink kind of thing.
Right.
And I'm in a nonprofit news organization, so I have the luxury to think that way. But something that makes me really sad and something that I think has lost a lot of credibility for journalists is the whole we have to be first. It doesn't matter if we're right, but we have to be first. No one cares if you're first. I've literally never met someone who is not I've literally never met a non-journalist, and they've been oh, I didn't consume that article because they were 5 minutes behind the competition.
Right.
No one cares. That's an example where journalists have imposed on their audience their own values. I, as a journalist, value being first, and I'm going to pretend like my readers care about that. and that's led to a lot of inaccuracy in the way we report, because you see it all the time with big breaking news, but you also see it with smaller stuff of just like the need to produce every day, the need to get the story out first, and you let things slide that you normally wouldn't.
So you were actually leading into my next question, and it was going to be, how do you think online news has changed the idea of credibility? And you've kind of touched on it with the, that need of instant, do you think that there are any other ways that it's probably changed?
Yeah, I also think we don't live, like, there's not one version of the truth. There never was, but now there's really not. So if I don't like the way that you, Washington Post, have covered something, I can discredit you by putting in the right set of Google words and finding some obscure site that validates my worldview of whatever we're talking about. And so, online news has done, and the advent of like anyone can be a journalist has done so much to damage the credibility of news organizations, because if I have an opinion, I can find something somewhere that backs it. Whether or not, that blog was written by like somebody in their 40s in their parents' basement, like you have no idea. But it's online, it's published, and it validates what I think. So I'm going to go with it over the Washington Post. I think that that's really sad. I also think that historic, traditional news organizations have created that to a degree. Like, I don't think that they're just innocent bystanders who now sadly have to compete with false news or false narratives. Like, there's so much more nuance there than that. So that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that, credibility is trust, and trust has to be earned, and trust can be lost. And if I'm the Washington Post or the New York Times, and I haven't done a whole lot to cover the majority of the nation, and I call myself a national news organization, if all I write about the Midwest is like that it's a flyover, a series of flyover states, and there's nothing good there, like, I'm not going to trust that news site if I live in Kansas City, right? And I think that that's like left out of this conversation oftentimes about credibility. And we see that at the local level too, right? Gannett bought the Commercial Appeal and has, in my opinion, not communicated very well to the people of Memphis about what that means. And also it's messed up, and it hasn't always apologized well. And that loses trust, and it loses credibility. So there's a temptation to be like, there are millions of blogs and Twitter profiles, and oh my gosh, online has, destroyed the credibility of journalists. And it's like, well, journalists also destroyed the credibility of journalists. Like, it's not we're not just innocent victims here.
And you've definitely touched on this, but how do you think social media has changed the idea or perception of credibility?
Yeah. I mean, it's, again, this idea that, like, anyone can be right. I think that a lot of people know that they should trust experts, right? Like, you're not going to go to somebody, you're not going to go to your aunt who's never studied medicine to be your doctor, right? In the same way you would think you would not go to just somebody on the street to be your provider of news. But again, it's a communication failure on the part of journalists. When's the last time you ever read how a journalist did the story, right? Like, I did this deep investigation into X thing, and I'm going to run that story online, and then I'm going to also weave throughout how I did the story so you trust my process. I think you're seeing more of that, especially on Twitter, which is, a great playground for journalists in a lot of ways, also a minefield, but I think you're seeing journalists tell their stories better. And social media has, in some ways, allowed them to do that when maybe the traditional structure of their news organization didn't previously. And my hope is that that actually helps credibility. I think social media can be a great way for journalists to reach out one-on-one to people who don't trust them. You know, you see really amazing national journalists having dialogues with people who are just kind of seem like trolls, honestly, but they have a dialogue with them. They, affirm their existence and try to respond to them politely and appropriately, and also firmly in what they know to be true. And I think that's really cool. So I think there's a lot of opportunity and potential with social media. I've also hearkened a lot in this conversation on the downfalls, which is anyone can say anything and it be held on the same level. But I think there's opportunity there as well.
Okay. All right. This last section of questions has to do with engagement and credibility, the relationship.
Yeah.
And you've answered this in bits and pieces previously, but do you think that there's a relationship between social engagement and credibility when it concerns online news?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not like if you do engagement, my opinion, if you do online engagement well, it'll lead to trust. It'll lead to credibility. If you don't put resources, time, and effort into how you engage people online, it's going to be a disaster. The comments section or the Facebook comments section of a news organization's Facebook page is a pretty good indicator with how much they value social engagement. If nobody, we address a lot of our Facebook threads, right?
Right.
Not because people are going off the rails, but because every once in a while you'll have people get into a really heated argument and just say mean things and attack each other, and that's against our comment policy, or they'll say a curse word and that's against our comment policy. And like I said, we explain this really clearly to our readers. We don't just delete a comment and move on. We spend time and effort and energy to make it a place where people actually want to have a dialogue. And I think that's led to a much higher quality of engagement, but also just more. More people comment on our stories, more people like our stuff, more people share our stuff. And there's a direct correlation with the amount of resources we've put in and then the gain we've gotten out of it. But again, it's tempting to have this conversation solely in how do journalists benefit? And that's the wrong conversation, because it's how does Memphis benefit? How do readers benefit? Social media can be such an amazing place for people who would never ever be in the same space to wind up on the same comment thread and agree with each other and disagree and have this really amazing dialogue. Again, it's a really beautiful public square, but it can very quickly become a dumpster fire if you don't care about it.
And this question, you touched this upon really early in our beginning of our conversation.
Right.
Describing the relationship, how you would generally describe the relationship between social engagement and credibility. You use the term relationship.
Right.
Is that you still believe that, or?
Yeah, very much so. I think, again, when I think about credibility and trust, I think about what I've done to inspire credibility and trust, or what I haven't done. And social media, social engagement online is just a piece of that bigger, a piece of this humongous part of journalism, which is how do people view you, and what space do you give them? If you only view readers as sources and as clicks on your website, I don't have a lot of loyalty for you. I don't have a lot of brand loyalty, right?
Right.
Especially if you piss me off sometimes. But if you produce products that I really value, that I think are, as important to my life as the shampoo I use and the coffee that I drink, then I'm going to value your brand. And I'm going to be loyal to you, and I'm probably going to engage with you online. So that relationship and how people think of you is really important. And social media and online engagement can be a really positive factor, or it can be really detrimental to that relationship.
Okay. Those are all the questions I have. Is there
Great.
anything else you'd like to say or haven't had a chance to?
That's a good way to end interviews, just in general. That's the way I end all my interviews. But no, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it. I just, like, when I think about Chalkbeat's engagement strategy, it's not one or the other. It's not, we only think about online engagement or we only think about in-person events. The two very much so go hand in hand. And that's something that I think can be lost in this conversation, especially when we're talking a lot about social media, which is your social media followers are real life people, and real life people want to interact with other real life people. And sometimes the best space for that is online. A lot of times it's in person. And so we use our social media feeds to promote a lot of our in-person events, and we've seen such a beautiful reciprocal relationship out of that, right? Of like people who follow us online come to our events, they bring our friends who didn't know we existed, they then follow us online, come to the next event, bring their friends, and it just keeps going, and it helps us build audience, and it helps us build readers, but more importantly, it helps us become better connected with our community. But yeah, I think it's an important topic. I'm glad you're